LGBTQI community. Our aim through these conversations is to provide emerging leaders with critical insights and knowledge about public service and different professional career paths available to them. During tonight's session, which is titled Hidden Faces of Immigration, we'll discuss the different immigration-related issues and challenges that our communities are facing. Expo will cover a broad range of topics, including sanctuary cities, undocumented immigration, family sponsorship, work visas, all that good stuff. I'd like to extend an extra special thank you to our speakers for taking the time to join us today. I know it's a busy time for everyone, and I'll also extend a special thank you to AARP for being a program sponsor, and to the DC Mayor's Office of Asian and Pacific Islander Affairs for being a partner and further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get us started with a quick poll. It's just a handful of questions. They're really designed to give our panelists a sense of who's with them in the audience and their experiences with immigration. So, let's see. I'll read these questions in case, give folks a chance to read them themselves. The first question is, what generation immigrant are you? First generation, second generation, third generation or later, or not an immigrant. Your relatives may have always lived here, and what the US is. The second question here, oh, I don't actually know if you can see them all at once. I'll keep going. The second question is, what type of visa or program did you or your relative come from or immigrate to? Did they have a family visa, an employment visa, a student visa, a refugee or asylum visa, other, or maybe you don't know? This question here is, do you have any relatives who would like to immigrate to the US? Yes or no? The fourth question is, are you or do you know someone who is or was undocumented? Another yes or no. And our last question is, have you experienced any anti-Asian sentiment for being perceived as foreign in the last 4 years? You can submit your answers through the poll that's on your screen.
Sorry to jump in. I'm Yung Tran, CAPAL staff. Just to clarify a few things, Alma is glitching a little bit. And so if you had issues hearing what she was saying, essentially we are doing a poll just to get a chance to figure out who is here in the audience today. And once we're done with the poll, we'll read out the results and then we will start our panel. Now that 90% have voted, I will share the results. And Alma, if we have better connection, we would love for you to read the results.
Can folks hear me okay? No. Assume folks can hear me. So you should be able to see the responses up on your screen. For this first question, what generation immigrant are you? It sounds like the vast majority of folks joining us tonight are second generation, the children of immigrants to the US. That's about 84% of the group. For this second question about what type of visa or program did you or your relative come from, immigrate to the US on, it sounds like about half, 42% were on a family visa. And then it's a pretty nice split between the rest. For this third question, do you have relatives who would like to immigrate to the US? It sounds like, again, a pretty close split. 58% said yes, they do. 42% no, they do not. For this fourth question, are you or do you know someone who is or was undocumented? 80% of the crowd said yes, which is a pretty high percent. And for this last question, have you experienced any anti-Asian sentiment for being perceived as foreign in the last 4 years? Again, the strong majority, 79% said yes. So thank you for completing that activity. I think that's some helpful context moving into the rest of the conversation. With that, I am going to turn things over to Sham, who will be our moderator tonight. By way of introduction, Sham is the Vice President of Programs at Asian Pacific Islander American Scholars. APIA Scholars is the nation's largest nonprofit provider of college scholarships for low-income, first-generation Asian and Pacific Islander American students. With that, Sham, I'll turn things over to you.
Thank you, Alma, and hello, everyone out there. Like Alma said, my name is Sham, and I'm so happy to be here. I will introduce myself briefly, and then we will get started. I identify as a second-generation immigrant, like most of you, and my parents immigrated from India in the late 70s, early 80s. I'm a first-generation college student. I was born in Baltimore, Maryland, and grew up here in the DMV area. I consider myself an educator. I've worked as a former teacher, and I've trained a lot of teachers. I see myself now as like a leadership coach, along with working at API Scholars. I work with individuals and teams across issues of diversity, inclusion, equity, and belonging. That said, for this panel, I am not an expert in immigration. And I do know what being an immigrant is. Certainly, it's part of my life story and identity for myself, the students I work with, and it's just as a human in this country. So I'm really excited to have this awesome team of panelists with us to hear their thoughts and and have all of us ask our questions to them. And so I just want to start right off the bat to have you start thinking about your questions that you may have, because we're going to open it up to questions fairly soon after maybe 2 questions. And as someone who works with students all the time, I like hearing students and other folks in the audience, I like hearing directly from you all. I'm also naturally curious, so I might ask a few questions here or there. And when you think about the current moment, there's just so much going on. Even just hearing about the banning of the H1b visas, the recent requirement that we heard of on student visas, the reduced traveling and xenophobia due to the pandemic, and the ever-present danger impacting our undocumented families and children. There's just so much. And so if I had the opportunity, I know I would want to know, what do I need to know and how can I help? But this panel isn't about me, it's about our panelists and you. So I'm going to ask the panelists to start to introduce themselves first, just share a little bit about your name, your background, your current role, and whatever you think is most important for us to know about you as we have this conversation on immigration. And so I'll start with, I'll go in order of what's on my screen here. We'll start with Lakshmi, then Jacinta, then Quinn, and then Glenn. All right. Hi, Lakshmi. Lakshmi, you're on mute. Yep.
Great, is that better? Can you all hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Sorry, also trying to use my phone because having a little bit of issue with computer audio, so please let me know if there's any problems. But hi everyone, I'm Lakshmi Sridharan. I'm really happy to be here with everyone today. I serve as the Executive Director of South Asian Americans Leading Together, based in Washington, DC. In terms of just a little bit about myself that I always like to share is that I am from the South, born and raised in Atlanta, Georgia, and really, I think, got into this work doing local organizing in the South, particularly in New Orleans, following Hurricane Katrina for a number of years, and realized that that's actually how I had connected with Dung from CAPAL originally years ago. And so I was really happy to reconnect. And we were talking about, how that was such a, I think, important moment, a really difficult moment in our country, and one that feels really resonant right now in terms of what it looks like to be kind of in the middle of crisis and also state violence. And that's really, I think, one of our 2 big lessons that I took away doing work in New Orleans for a number of years. So yeah, just bringing that, that history with me wherever I go and doing national work now. So thank you.
Hi, I'm Jacinta Ma, and I've been I'm now the Vice President. They just changed our titles. I keep tripping over that. I'm the Vice President of Policy and Advocacy at the National Immigration Forum since June of 2014. And prior to working on immigration issues, I spent about 20 years working on a variety of race-related civil rights issues, including two stints working at what is now known as Asian Americans Advancing Justice in Washington, D.C. I was there first as a legal fellow when I was just starting out my career. And just before I joined the National Immigration Forum, I was there serving as their deputy director. I am the daughter of Chinese immigrants. I grew up in the Los Angeles area. My dad came to the US when he was 15 to join my grandfather, who was running a store in Wichita, Kansas. They were probably the only Asian people in Wichita at the time. And my mom came to the United States as a graduate student at Stanford. And this is where my dad was getting his master's degree in engineering. And so that is where they met. And it's from my experience, with my parents and those of my extended relatives, where I really feel like I've seen firsthand how immigrants contribute to our nation. And so for me, when I started to see the national conversation about immigrants becoming more and more negative, I really decided that I wanted to work on immigration issues, because as a daughter of immigrants, I see the country, I felt like the country was very welcoming of us, and that my family got a lot of opportunities. And so I really wanted to continue to work on immigration issues. And so I joined the National Immigration Forum, which is a national nonprofit working on just basically advocating for the value of immigrants and immigration to the nation. And so I really think that it's important to promote a constructive conversation about immigrants and our broken immigration system. And where we differ as an organization is that we work with conservatives and moderates to advocate for immigration policies. And so that makes us a little bit different.
I think I'm next, but I forgot the order. In case, great. Hi, everyone. My name is Quinn Din. I'm the Executive Director of CRAC, the Southeast Asia Resource Action Center. Like many of you, I identify as second generation. Particularly, I identify as a second generation daughter of refugees. My parents came here as refugees after fleeing Vietnam. So they were considered part of the 1980s cohort of boat people who fled Vietnam after the Vietnamese war and the poverty and the trauma and the political persecution that was happening in Vietnam. I grew up, actually I was born in New Orleans, but grew up in California, Texas, Hawaii, and then back to California. And for me, immigration is just so much a part of our identities, and it's so personal that no matter what issue you work on, you really can't get away from what it means to be an immigrant, what it means to be a refugee for Asian American Pacific Islander communities. And I'm really excited to be joined by my colleagues for this conversation and to joining you all today to build community together.
Hi, and I'm Glenn Magpantay. I'm the Executive Director of NCAPI, the National Queer Asian Pacific Islander Alliance. We're a national federation of about 60 local LGBT, Asian, South Asian, Southeast Asian, and Pacific Islander organizations across the country. And most of what we do is around leadership development and capacity building for those organizations so that their work is more impactful, has greater reach, and is more inclusive. Advocacy at the intersection of immigrants' rights, racial justice, and queerness. And of course, visibility, bringing our narratives and experiences to the fore. Because so many times, all the gays are white, all the Asians are straight, no disrespect to anybody who's on this, and all the immigrants are Latinx. Where do we belong? Where are our narratives? And for our community as queer Asians, so many of us who are immigrants, we work at the intersection of these issues to try to amplify our experiences either on as queer people around immigration, which I'll talk about later on, or as people of color and immigrants in the LGBT rights agenda in America. Just 2 points that I don't think anybody had said, but I just want to make sure that it's on the docket. Asians are the nation's fastest growing racial minority group in the country. We are the largest segment of immigrants coming to the United States. That is both legal immigrants and undocumented immigrants. We are, and more of us are coming out of the closet as queer, trans, bisexual, lesbian, or gay. And yet our stories, narratives, and issues are often marginalized. So we come to this work bringing those things together so that we can be all of who we are and live authentically, both in our advocacy and in our identities.
Great, awesome. Thank you all for sharing a little bit about yourselves and also priming the conversation. And I do want to, I am happy to now open the Q&A and the chat for you all's questions. I'm gonna ask a question to the panelists, but everyone in the audience, feel free to start sending in your questions, because that way it can be more of a conversation dialogue. The conversation or the question I have for our panelists here is, it's about your why. So what brings you to your work? What is your why? And what policies or issues around immigration are you currently advocating around? So a little bit about your why and what policies and issues are you really promoting or advocating around. Why don't we start with Jacinta?
Sure. So I said this a little bit in the introduction, but my why really is promoting a constructive conversation about immigrants and immigration to the nation. We have really entered a time where immigration is, it's an issue that's in the public sphere all the time, right? We hear about it constantly. And some people would say, it's really terrible because of the way that immigration is being framed, but it's also a real opportunity, right? So, most of the time when I was doing work as an Asian American advocate, it was very hard to get anybody to hear or, care about Asian Americans. And so you'd always be like banging and saying like, hey, we're here, like Asian American issues are important. And here on immigration, you don't have to do that. People are talking about immigration all the time. But the current picture is, being painted, immigrants are being painted mostly as like takers and not people who contribute to the United States. They are seen as threats potentially and not protectors of our country. And they're being portrayed as people who are sort of isolating and not integrating. And I think we really need to be able to create a better public narrative, paint a better picture of our future that we can all agree on, which really recognizes the importance and the value of immigrants in our future. And I think that's really what drives me in this work. And in terms of the issues that we work on, as our name says, National Immigration Forum, we work on all the immigration issues. So any immigration issue, we're probably involved or have a view on it.
Yeah, let's, I'm curious I want us to start talking more about this public narrative and what is the public narrative out there about us and what can we do to start either changing or contributing that narrative. Let's move over to Lakshmi now and just, again, Lakshmi, a little bit about your why and then what are some of the issues that you're working on currently?
Yeah, I think I touched on the why a little bit earlier, but just to add to that, I think for me, just growing up in the South and actually not growing up around a lot of immigrant communities a little bit outside of Atlanta, I think for me, my entry point into the work has always been around racial justice and of course, seeing immigration very much as a racial justice issue. And so that, I think, is what has always driven me to be part of this larger movement. And a lot of, I was very early on politicized in sort of a Black liberation framework. And that's kind of what I carry with me into the immigrant justice work that we do now. And hopefully we'll have a chance to talk about that a little bit more later. But in terms of some of the policies and issues that we work at SALT, immigrant justice, hate violence and civil rights are sort of the three broad areas that we focus on. And within immigration, we really, over the last I would say at least 5 years, have focused really on the most marginalized South Asian American populations. I think there's kind of like Glenn was saying about like some of the stereotypes around Asian Americans and particularly South Asian Americans has typically been around sort of this narrative of high-skilled H1b workers, visa holders, and some of our narratives, like my own, which I didn't share earlier, do come from that community. But we also realize that there are so many resources and advocacy and capacity that have been dedicated to those communities, and that there hasn't really been a South Asian organization that has focused on the other more marginalized populations within our community. And so to that end, we focus a lot on folks who are impacted by detention, which has been, I think, a real growing issue in the South Asian community with, the election of Modi in India and sort of the repression of religious minorities and caste-oppressed populations that are being forced to seek asylum in the U.S. So again, in the last 5 years, that's been an issue that, has become a high priority for us. We all know the asylum system has really been gutted over the last many years, not just now, but is, virtually non-existent in this country at this point. So again, asylum seekers, refugees, folks who are DACA and temporary protected status, TPS recipients, those are all populations and policies that we are continuing to advocate for. And I think, one opportunity that we see now with these recent executive orders that have impacted H1b populations and now international students, like folks mentioned earlier, there feels like there's a political education opportunity to kind of bring immigrant populations across the kind of range of or the spectrum of statuses to come together and really see how this country is attacking immigrants across the spectrum. And, we've had some divides within the South Asian community around many folks in the H1b kind of more mainstream lobby not be supportive of DACA and TPS recipients. And so again, we see an organizing opportunity now to bring some of those populations within our community together. So those are some of the areas that we're focused on.
Yeah, thank you. I know our family, at least my family events are always heated as we talk about H1b visas and undocumented folks. Yeah, it's important to have those conversations, even with those folks who are close to us. Thank you. We'll go over to Glenn. And Glenn, what are some issues that you and your organization are currently working on and advocating for?
I love Lakshmi and I love doing this with Lakshmi because for us, H1b visas is really critical. And, it ties into what was just announced just the day before yesterday. Or was it yesterday? Oh my gosh. Trump's announcement of F1 visas. So many of us, and we did an assessment of the immigrant, foreign-born folks who are queer in this country. And they really exist in about 4 categories. They're either green card holders, LPRs, they are undocumented, or they're on a visa. And the 2 visas are H1b visas. They work at Microsoft, they work at Apple, or they're F1s and they're students. And so for us as in CAPIA, these visas are critical for our community because what happens so often is that when foreign nationals are abroad, they're there, but when they come here, they can be out. They can live their lives authentically. They can be who they are. And when they go back home, they go back into the closet. And it's just so often real. What's also interesting that we found with H1b visa holders is there's a lot of East Asians and South Asians here on those visas. And a number of the women who are here in the STEMs, science, science, technology, engineering, and math, a higher number of them, of the women who are H1b who are queer identified, tend to be queer identified. And so for lesbians who tech, a lot of them are Asians. The other 2 things that I wanted to talk about that are of need and interest is DACA and family immigration. DACA. So we had a great win. I spent about 17 years as a lawyer at the Asian American Legal Defense Fund. before, and we worked on Daca at Incapia, and we had a brief at the Supreme Court on the experience of LGBT DACA recipients, because for our community, there's so much more at stake if Trump was able to cancel DACA. So many countries in the world still criminalize homosexuality. And so for queer people, if Trump canceled DACA, it would not just result in a deportation, but a death sentence or prison sentence for many queer DACA recipients. So we had to do so much work. And we had a great temporary victory at the Supreme Court 2 weeks ago, where Trump cannot cancel DACA by tweet. We kind of really have to follow the law and the rules. He can cancel it. He has a legal obligation. You just can't tweet it out. You got to do what the government does. Then the last thing I just want to say, visas, DACA, is family immigration. And I'm going to put into the chat an action alert that we're doing on the Reuniting Families Act. And it's the bill that will preserve family immigration. It will expand visas for workers and green cards. But for queer folk, the definition of family is broader. It's not just, it's great that we can get married now, but can you bring your partner over? You can do that under Windsor, but that needs to be codified into federal law. But the laws still do not recognize same-sex asylum seekers or refugees. And when you get resettled into this country, one of you goes to, and you come from a country which doesn't recognize same-sex marriage, one of you gets resettled in Lowell, Massachusetts, the other one in Wisconsin. And you're a couple. Should you not be resettled together if you are a queer refugee? And so these are some of the things that we are working on that has a disparate and disproportionate impact on LGBTQ immigrant communities.
Yeah, thank you, Glenn. Lynn?
I really appreciate my colleagues for the framing that they've shared in terms of both reframing what immigration policy means, but also the framing of belonging. Because for me, I think what brings me into the work is really an opportunity to redefine America and to redefine what belonging means, particularly for our communities. One of my first moments of politicization was when I came to Washington, D.C. as a high school senior. I was super excited to see the Vietnam War Memorial, and I was expecting actually to see Vietnamese names. I was expecting to see the Dins and the Trans and the Nguyen's of all the families, the innocent women and children, and the soldiers who also died. And I didn't. All I saw was this like shadowy reflection of myself along with everyone else. And in hindsight, I realized that was the first moment where I really felt marginalized, where I felt like this is not my home, this is not my country. And it led me on an entire path to really discover what that means through incredible ethnic studies curriculum, Asian American studies curriculum at UC Berkeley, and student organizing and the community organizing. And for CRAC's work, one of the biggest issues that we work on is around this idea of belonging, particularly for folks who arrived as refugees, but who actually have deportation orders back to countries they fled because of past criminal conviction records that they have, primarily for crimes of poverty and youth. And I describe it that way because over 80% of the 15,000 individuals with deportation orders had those orders because of crimes that they committed when they were young people, resettled in low income, low resource communities, and finding support in gangs as opposed to schools or families where they really should have been finding community. And yet our immigration policies allow them to be deported, even though they have already served their sentences. And even though the American government is the reason why they had to flee in the first place as refugees, and creating this huge displacement and disruption within our communities because it impacts not just those 15,000, but their partners, their children, and the elders that they actually take care of. So for us, our work is really about challenging what it means to be a good versus bad immigrant, which I'm sure we'll also talk about, and really reframing immigration policies to be one that defines America as part of being free, part of being just, and part of being humane. And very often that is not the rhetoric, and those are not the goals that are being pushed for in our immigration debate.
Great. Okay, so much stuff here to talk about. Let's and we have some questions in the Q&A, and so these are really meaty questions. So I'll like chop them up and direct them to certain panelists. The first question is for you, Jacinta. Is in terms of like, how do you effectively advocate for issues around immigration? And in all caps, it says, especially when speaking with conservative and Republican representatives. So any advice on, and you mentioned this earlier. So yeah, how do you approach that, and how do you effectively advocate?
So, you know, I think the way we approach this is that we try to reach people where they are, right? We try to understand where people are coming from and help them understand, because a lot of times people just don't know a lot about immigration. They don't understand the intricacies. I think a lot of people, for instance, just think, you know, if somebody's undocumented, that they're just choosing not to follow the law, choosing not to become, you know, to have legal status. And people don't understand the complexity of how few visas there are, how few paths there are to get to the United States, and just how complicated it is to be able to get to the United States. So really a lot of it is just providing education. I think there's a lot of times the center right and conservatives may share similar viewpoints, be able to come to similar conclusions on policies, but they often are put off by the tactics of the left. They don't like the language of the left. They don't like protests. You know, they think they're not productive, right? So some of it is approach as well. And so, you know, we've gone into offices on the Hill, conservative offices, with Christian dreamers. These are, you know, dreamers, including Asian ones, who are, you know, their faith is very important to them, and they identify, you know, as Christian dreamers. There's an organization called Voices of Christian Dreamers. And we've gone into very conservative offices, and we go and we have these conversations. They share their stories, and the staff members there say, like, wow, this is a really great meeting. You know, people like you are just very, you know, sympathetic. You know, and I've had meetings where people say, this is the first time I've been able to have a really civil conversation about immigration. And so I think, you know, for us, we try to think about who are the messengers that Republicans listen to, and who do we have in our network who support immigration, and who, you know, also find us to be a trusted source of information, right? Because I think right now, as we all know, it's very hard to know who to trust and who to believe. And so we have really built up our reputation as an organization that moderates can come to, moderates and conservatives can come to for, you know, trusted information. And so I think for me, those would be the tips that I have.
Awesome. Anyone else want to jump in here when talking to others with a conservative or Republican perspective, or any perspective in general? How do you work with them and advocate for your issues effectively?
I think something I would add is actually reflecting on the current moment that we're in, particularly the movement for Black Lives, and having conversations about things that people don't know a whole lot about. For example, racism within our families, talking about anti-Blackness, talking about police brutality in communities of color. And it reminds me that oftentimes these are not one-off conversations, that it really is about having multiple conversations and a relationship with these different stakeholders, whether it be our family members or these members of Congress, to build a long-term relationship where we're educating each other and engaging with one another. Oftentimes, even when we're working with Democratic or folks who already agree with us, it has sometimes taken years to push us into a more progressive position. For example, about 6 years ago, the last time that there was an immigration bill, folks with past criminal conviction records, for example, had increased policies that would actually increase the number of folks who would be deportable. And so it's taken us that long to move the needle forward or to move the conversation to a different place. So I think it is just being mindful that these are not single conversations. It really does sometimes take quite a long time and quite a bit of shift in narrative that is required.
Thank you, Quinn. We're gonna move on to Amber's question in the Q&A. I don't know if the audience are able to see it, but I'm gonna swing this over to Lakshmi. Lakshmi, can you talk about Amber's questions around how COVID is spreading fast in the ICE detention and how to advocate for the release of nonviolent detainees, a Clean Dream Act and the HEAL Act. And for those that may not know what the Dream Act or HEAL Act is, can you share a little bit about it and then also share some of that perspective?
Sure. I don't think I can speak as well to the HEAL Act as some other folks on the panel, but in terms of, I think, I think the spread of COVID, of course, in detention facilities has been a huge issue. And we were actually just on a call with some of our partners in Washington State this morning who reported a pod of immigrant women who are facing so many challenges as a result of COVID spreading in the facility, and in particular, the ways in which that particular pod is being disinfected by employees in the facility because of COVID, but also employees not having the proper equipment and also using really heavy chemicals that are impacting detained people in a number of ways. They're already suffering a lot of other health and civil rights violations within detention facilities, and to have this now on top of that. And I think what we've realized over time with advocates on the ground is that this is an opportunity to call for, there's so many release them all campaigns going on right now. And I think this is actually, a way to get more and more folks out of detention. Unfortunately, there's a lot of limitations with that. There are people who, because they've been languishing in detention for so long, have agreed to just sort of deport themselves, and also known as self-deportation. And many countries are actually not allowing people, particularly who have been detained in the U.S., to come back to their country of origin for a number of health reasons. So I think, it's a really complicated and challenging situation, but at the same time, we're also trying to utilize this opportunity to get people's cases moved faster who have just been languishing in detention and not being able to access the legal channels that they should be guaranteed. And of course, there's a whole host of language barriers and other issues in accessing legal support for folks who are detained. So again, something that we're actively working on with our partners in Washington State and also in Texas and Louisiana, where this has been a major issue. I think with the Clean Dream Act, I think, going back to what Quinn was saying, even with communicating with Democrats when this was, in the works starting in 2017, when Trump actually canceled the Daca program, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, and the DREAM Act being one solution that would provide a pathway to citizenship for people who had Daca status, and that really being the legislative fix for this executive action. That was established by executive authority by the Obama administration and then eliminated by the Trump administration. So I think many of us learned, really the importance of codifying things like this into legislation so that it can live beyond particular administrations. But I'll say, like Quinn was saying, there were so many challenges even communicating the importance of this to Democrats who we thought would be sort of, quote unquote, on our side, who were actually advancing, right, a lot of the same arguments around sort of the value of migrants, this whole language around, through no fault of their own, as if there had to be sort of a criminal act committed by, by an immigrant or their family member to be able to justify that these are sort of innocent children who should be spared. And so there are a lot of problematic arguments, I think, along the way that Democrats were also advancing. So a lot of that narrative shift that Quinn was talking about. And I think one of the best things about the Dream Promise Act, which ultimately is what resulted last year, is that the Dreamers who were leading this fight really understood what it meant to advance legislation that doesn't harm other immigrant communities, and that was a major part of their strategy. And so they, teamed up with temporary protected status advocates to include that population in this legislation. And so that's what we have today, the Dream Promise Act, and we'll see what happens in the Senate. And so I think those have been some of the challenges with these, what seems like should be very easy legislative fixes that would work in a Democratic majority Congress, but have not. And so I think, those we'll continue to see.
I'll just add, since we're talking about DACA, I just want to make sure that people know, a lot of times when people are talking about DACA and Dreamers, it's unclear just how many of these are Asian. And so, of the about 650,000 folks who currently have DACA, I think it's about 17,000 or almost 3% who are come from Asian countries. And I think the country, from which the most Asian DACA recipients come from is South Korea. So there were about 6,540 from South Korea. But, you have people from the Philippines, India, Pakistan, China, Bangladesh, so a lot of Asian countries have people who are Dreamers. So I just wanted to make sure we mentioned that.
But Jacinta, that's DACA recipients as opposed to DACA eligible.
That's right.
And
right.
The reason why I point that out is, look, Koreans did an incredible job of organizing on DACA, and they won it, right? And so they claimed that benefit. But they're not the largest possible beneficiaries. I think it's actually Chinese and Indians, right? And there are other reasons why. That's another webinar on why those numbers are lower than it should be. But I do want to note that there's a smaller group of people that win rights and benefits for larger numbers of people. And we should avail ourselves of that right. And those who won it should claim it. And that's what Koreans did, which is pretty incredible.
There are about almost 170,000 who are estimated to be DACA eligible. And this was like from a couple of years ago. And so it's probably even more as more people have gotten older.
Yeah,
and
that's right.
Eligible. And I think that means about of the 10% who people thought could be eligible for DACA, only about 4% actually signed up. So it's a much lower share. And we can talk about why, all of that too. That's another webinar if people are interested, but just wanted to note those figures.
All right, let's move the conversation to some of the comments or questions that have been coming up around just the rise in hate crimes against Asian Americans. And so we have some acts that have been mentioned, the Jabara No Hate Act, and some Heroes Act. And then there's also a question here about just why, and I know with students I work with there, we go into it and it's a whole, 2-day thing. But when it comes to why do you think this is the question specifically is why do you think this is a case for ANHPIs relative to other racial minority groups, even when some of them are second generation, that they may feel some of this racist or anti-foreigner or xenophobic remarks and comments. And so let's shift the conversation over there, and I'll just open up to the group.
I can start just a little bit on the hate violence piece. At SALT, we've been tracking hate violence specifically against Muslim, Sikh, Arab American, and Middle Eastern communities, really since 9/11. But again, anticipating the uptick against violence in our communities in the lead up to the 2016 presidential election is where we really, I think, focused our efforts. And we're seeing that again now, you know, as and so many of the other panelists on this call and others are tracking the hate violence that we're seeing against Asian Americans right now in response to COVID. And, you know, I think, I think it's really important for us to think about, like, what are the government policies that are actually leading to hate violence, and to sort of understand the relationship between interpersonal and state violence. And I think the Jabara Hire No Hate Act is in a lot of ways unprecedented, because it's a piece of legislation that was named after Khalid Jabara and Heather Heyer, who are two victims of hate crimes, very high profile hate crimes, and very heinous hate crimes that were actually, neither of their deaths were included in the FBI data on hate crimes. And so that again shows you just the woeful underreporting, and also acknowledgement by our federal government of the impact of the violence in our communities. And so it's named in their honor. And I think one of the important pieces of that legislation, which it was great that it was included in the most recent HEROES Act in the House, is that state agencies and even federal agencies are not required to report hate crimes. And so this particular piece of legislation is focused on making that mandatory, and actually withholding funds from state law enforcement agencies for not doing that, which has never happened before. And it also has a restorative justice component, which I think is really important, because I think in the South Asian community, one of the things, you know, many of us, you know, went hard on prosecuting hate crimes following 9/11, and, you know, not necessarily thinking about how we may be reinforcing the criminal justice system in doing so. And so I think that is an important lesson that we're kind of thinking about, you know, what does it mean to hold law enforcement accountable, but also not expanding the police state in the process of doing that, and holding that complexity. And so I think the restorative justice component in the Jabara Hire Act is important, because it gives that opportunity to think more deeply about that, especially in the case of perpetrators possibly being other people of color or young people. And again, you know, giving us the opportunity to think about how are we connecting that back to white supremacist hate violence and policies that are actually leading to the uptick that we're seeing. So again, I think that has really been a focus for us, is that relationship to the state. And so, yeah, I'm sorry, I don't know too much about the CAPAL legislation either. I'm sure other folks could speak more to that, but yeah.
We're talking about the rise in hate crimes, and how can we best advocate for, how for ourselves and others, also, and maybe even getting to some of the root causes as you think about your own work.
So this is not something that I work on currently. So I'm just going to, share a little bit of an experience that I had working on anti-Asian violence, very early on in my career. So one of the things that I was doing at the Asian American Justice Center was trying to track incidents of anti-Asian violence. That was like one of the things that I did for the whole year. And I would collect all of these other reports of anti-Asian violence, and this was back in the mid-90s. And I would put them all into a report. And after doing this for, a number of months, I got to a point where if I saw a group of white teenagers, I would cross the street because I would be scared. And I grew up in a primarily white suburban area where, I, as a high schooler, hung out with groups of white men, never, like white teenagers, never had that feeling, right? And so what it told me, and that has since gone away right after I stopped doing that work. But what it said to me is that when a person is subjected to a stereotype or a vision of what is going to happen based on race, that you can really internalize that. And so when we have public officials who are constantly saying, Chinese folks are spies, and just, immigrants are threats and immigrants are criminals, and, all of these very negative viewpoints, which we know actually don't have a lot of basis in truth, but they're but you're not necessarily subjected to the other side of this, right? A lot of people, they don't have those constant experiences with, second generation Asian Americans. And so it's difficult, I think, for some people not to be able to sort of separate, what they're seeing and what they're intaking, and really think about it from a more rational point of view, because it's just this constant barrage of an image or a stereotype that's not accurate. And so I think these kinds of things where we have legislation to address hate crimes, to do reporting, all of these things are really, really necessary, because we're up against this constant narrative that is, really harmful. And so we need to have proactive policies to try to mitigate the narrative.
Glenn, it looks like you want to jump in. Am I reading your body language? No. Cool.
No, I'm having trouble reading that. The font is so tiny. I'm a little old, so I can't see anything. Sorry.
Cool. No worries. Anyone else? Quinn, do you want to speak to anything around the hate violence and comments within directed towards ANHPIs?
I think I definitely +1 to Jacinta's analysis around how Asian Americans are depicted in our media and our narratives that we read about. And there's a huge body of work in the Asian American studies world around Asian Americans being seen as the perpetual foreigner. And I think in contrast to that, sometimes in the work around racial and social justice, actually, the opposite happens, or an interesting component happens where Asian Americans aren't seen as people of color and are seen more as white or not experiencing any needs or challenges, which aligns more with the model minority myth. And so it's that constant push and pull of those two stories that continue to perpetuate these stereotypes that I think really are the mainstream narratives that we see, as opposed to the ones that we experience and the counter narratives, the counter realities that we're trying to push for.
So many people I've worked with talk about just how assimilation has impacted their own sense of identity, and the impact of that as they think about whiteness and white supremacy and people and aligning with people of color. So yeah. Let's move on to this one question, and feel free for those in the audience, keep the questions coming. We want this to be directed by all of you in the audience. We're going to switch over to H1b visas, and Glenn, I'll ask you to speak to this question about how do we talk about the immigrants who don't necessarily immigrate on the H1b visas, more specifically the frontline workers, and sort of the narratives that are being told about highly educated Asian immigrants, and how that contributes to the model minority myth.
Yeah, no, I wanted to take this because I appreciated Ms. Anonymous thank you for the question and the framing. I don't know who sent it in, but I want to take this question, and it ties into the question before around how do we talk about this with Republicans. I spent about almost 20 years in civil rights enforcement before coming to this gig at Incapia. And let me just say, I have sued many Democrats and Republicans, and I have gotten the best settlements and worked with Republican lawmakers, and Democrats will fight you tooth and nail. So I just want to say, this narrative that Republicans are anti-immigrant and Democrats aren't, it ain't true. I know a number of Democrats who, if they feel threatened, they'll be the most anti-immigrant force that you could imagine. And Republicans could be inclusive. I mean, they may have a business analysis or whatever, or a libertarian analysis, but it still recognizes elements of interconnectedness. And when we talk with people who are, quote, on the other side, it is finding that moment in which we come together, where we could agree. And I think Jacinta did a great framing at the beginning of showing how we are, I took notes, could you believe it? Takers, not providers, isolators, not in integrators. I can't read my own writing. Anyway, it doesn't matter. With H1, I want to defend and hold up H1b visa holders. And I said that in the beginning because those are perceived to be the privileged immigrants. They're also the queer ones. They're also the ones who are leaving homes, building a better life for their kids, some of them who are you, right, in this audience. And that is a struggle too, which I think also needs to be informed. I get that businesses are prompting up H1Bs and there are powerful allies and advocates there. And there are also powerful advocates for undocumented workers, maybe not as powerful as IBM. But the goal is to show, and this is what we try to do in CAPIA, is to show that professional workers and undocumented workers are both screwed in our immigration system. That we don't have access to green cards, that we are all trying to make a better life for ourselves and our families. And, so when people do compromise, then that's when we slam them. But it is framing an interconnectedness that we have, that this whole, and Quinn talked about this notion of the good immigrant versus the bad immigrant, the low skilled versus the high skilled. It's all a fiction. We all are not white Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, whatever. I don't know what the majority population is now. And so trying to put that out, I think is critical. The other piece that I want to push back on is this model minority myth. And so I teach, outside of this gig, because I don't get paid enough, I also teach a few classes at Columbia and Hunter on Asian American studies. And we talk about the model minority myth. But, I don't think it's a myth. It is vested in reality. A myth is, Zeus's tear falling down into some clamshell and then voila, Aphrodite is born and some god comes out. That's a myth. It is undeniable that there are so many of us who are at Harvard and Yale, at the specialized schools. We do, on the aggregate, have a higher income on the aggregate. Now, we need to do data disaggregation and there are groups that are left out. I get it. But the myth is not a myth, it's more of a stereotype. Is that you take a small attribute of a population and you blow it up and you apply it to all. And that is where it is wrong. And I put that out there and I challenge the model minority myth as a myth because it's not entirely a myth. Many of us are in elite institutions. Many of us are privileged. The question becomes, how do we recognize that privilege and use that privilege for not only our advancement, but for some others? Look, if you're the only Asian in a boardroom or that achieved a scholarship, good for you. And claim it. That is yours and your hard work. You should not be ashamed of that. But you must recognize, why are you the only person who got that scholarship or are in that boardroom or in an executive position? And how do you open up the door to bring others in? And that is your responsibility. Too much of this work, I think, is guilting Asians. White liberal guilt. Now we have like Asian privilege guilt. And if you want to feel guilty, that's fine, right? Go talk to a therapist. But I think what it is about recognizing your privilege and owning it. And don't be ashamed of it. I mean, I wouldn't boast about it. That's probably not a good thing. But see what you can do to ameliorate the circumstances for others. Because so many others do not have the privileges that you all have. And I know CAPAL, worked with y'all for 15 years. So I have a sense of who's in this audience. That is what y'all need to do. You all are great. And you all have achieved so much in your studies and your accomplishments. Claim it, use it, but don't just use it for yourselves. Use it in the service of the community and for others who should also be where you are. And I'm not just talking about other Asians, I'm talking about Black folk, people with disabilities, those of us who are not there. All right, that's me. Thank you.
Powerful, Glenn. I'm going to open it up for reactions and just thoughts from others on the call.
So I'm going to start with the immigration part of it because the model minority thing. I don't think I can be as eloquent as Glenn on that. But so on the immigration piece, it's a little bit of a myth that people who don't have, and so when we're talking about high skilled, we're talking about people with higher education. It's not actually the skills that you bring, it's about your education. And so it's a little bit of a myth that you can come in as an unskilled immigrant. There aren't any unskilled immigrant visas. I mean, you could say maybe the diversity visa, well, even them, like they have to go through so many different requirements, they end up being high skilled immigrants. So the only people who could possibly come in on sort of an unskilled visa, those are family members, right? So family-based immigration is where you're getting people who don't have higher education who are coming in. And so right now in our country, we have about, the split in people coming in, it's about 2/3 family immigration and 1/3 employment-based visas. And what we've seen trending over time is that now, even amongst the family-based immigrants, we're getting a higher and higher percentage of those folks having a college degree or more. And so what we're seeing is that our people coming in are tending to have more education. And so it's kind of, so it feels like when people are in the public talking about merit-based immigration system and how we need to make sure that we've got the best and the brightest coming in, we're not really recognizing that America runs on having a lot of different kind of immigrants. And I think it's been really interesting to me during COVID-19, how we've been able to talk about the narrative of the essential immigrant worker. And so now, like, all this time we've been talking about these temporary agricultural workers and, and other ag workers, and the ag industry is where we have the highest percentage of undocumented workers. Now, all of a sudden, everybody's talking about how essential they are. But yet we're still not talking about trying to solve their problem of not having legal status and being able to stay in the United States, despite how important they are. So I think that that's part of the conversation that's a little bit missing when we're talking about the distinction between high skilled and lower skilled, is that we're not talking about there, like Glenn said, everybody has an issue and we really need to reform the whole system, but we're not sort of tying that together and making sure that everyone moves forward, understanding that this whole system is really tied together and we need to solve a lot of it together.
Have another question that just came in, and it's about data disaggregation for the ANHPI community. I'm going to pitch this to Quinn because one of the earliest things I think it was last year around this time, I saw the work that CRAC did with the LA Unified School District, and I was just so excited. But you could talk about in context of that or immigration, Quinn. But yeah, the importance of data disaggregation in the ANHPI community.
Yeah, great question. And actually, Glenn teed me up for it with his last comments around the model minority myth and what our community's outcomes look like in aggregate. So as many of us know, when we do look at Asian Americans in aggregate, this includes more than 30 different communities. And oftentimes what that means is that the experiences of smaller communities get completely masked. And so when you think about data having the power to reveal, for us, it actually conceals the real reality of what's really happening across our communities. So when you look at data that is broken down or disaggregated, which is the opposite of aggregate, you begin to see the different experiences that our communities have. So for Southeast Asian Americans, in particular, folks who came here with a very different, on a very different immigration stream, meaning folks came with nothing, but oftentimes their shirts on their backs, and also came from war-torn countries with very limited education backgrounds, that translates here over to the US too, into lower outcomes in education, into intergenerational and cross-generational poverty that we're seeing for our communities, because the majority of communities still live in low-income neighborhoods and still experience poverty at higher rates compared to American families. Our health disparity rates are also vary across different Asian American experiences. And when you lump us all under the Asian category, you really lose the reality of the diversity and the reality of the disparities and inequities that continue to exist. And for us, we see this as a systemic barrier that perpetuates the stereotype of Asian Americans as thriving overall and needing no support or resources or dealing with any type of inequity at all. And so for us, that's the reason why pushing for policies to disaggregate data is a huge step to really moving, to really addressing the inequities that continue to exist in our communities, from education to health, to immigration, to economics, housing, all of it, to be able to really see the real lived experiences that have happened and are continuing to happen. And without this data, these inequities just continue to be perpetuated and ignored.
All right. Well, we're coming up towards the end. I put out a call for either one or two more questions from the group. I think we're good there. For closing remarks, I thought we could do something a little backwards. Instead of like going over through your like background and history at the top of the call. How did you get to be so awesome? And so if you could share with the team or with the audience a little bit about your path and how you've gotten to where you are now, I'm sure it will inspire some of our CAPAL audience members to think about their own trajectory and their own path. Let's start off with Lakshmi, and then we'll start off with Lakshmi, do Jacinta, Quinn, and then Glenn for the closing.
Great. What a lovely question. I think similar to Quinn, I was also, sort of in addition to what I shared about being born and raised in the South, I was also fortunate to be politicized as an undergraduate student at UC Berkeley, and shared some time with Quinn in the Ethnic Studies department and many of the same organizations. And at the time in the early 2000s, I'm dating myself now, there had just been a recent ban on affirmative action, and it had, was, I believe, first in Michigan, and then it came to California by the same person, Ward Connerly, who was going around the country helping spark this legislation. And so our class, the incoming class of 2001, was actually the first class at UC Berkeley that really demonstrated the destructive impact of eliminating affirmative action. And so that was sort of an immediate form of being politicized coming in to campus, and also I'm sure folks may be familiar with sort of just the kind of continuous attacks on ethnic studies curriculum and programs across the country, mainly in the West Coast, and that was happening. And we had a 5-year agreement following a hunger strike in 1999 to keep the department open that students initiated at that time when it was being threatened to be closed. And there was a 5-year agreement that the university agreed to. And so there were several things that they had promised the student body that even by 2001 and by 2004, which was the last year of the 5-year agreement, hadn't been met yet. And so a lot of our work was fighting for those things, including a multicultural center and active recruitment and retention of students of color. So some of those early experiences and fighting for living wages for campus workers were some of the first experiences that I had. And then when I graduated in 2005 is the same year that Hurricane Katrina happened. And so that sort of pulled me back south again to live for a number of years in New Orleans. And, like I mentioned at the top of the call, the ways in which Indigenous Black communities in New Orleans were internally displaced so violently after Katrina was, I think, another moment of politicization for me, and actually sparked my own kind of career path to work only in Black-led and Black-serving organizations until I came to SALT as sort of a way to really deeply understand racial justice in this country. And so I'm really grateful for kind of having made that decision early on in my career, and now to sort of bring those lessons of what it looked like to kind of fight displacement, gentrification, and really privatization of so many public resources and benefits in New Orleans that followed Hurricane Katrina and happened so rapidly down there, and that you see in other cities, and that I've seen specifically in cities that are Black-led, like Detroit, Atlanta, so many other places that we're seeing that don't happen as rapidly as Hurricane Katrina, but have happened over time. And so I chose to pursue kind of more education in urban planning, kind of as a way to think about what are some of the material ways that we can create just communities. So between that kind of the Black liberation lens and a place-based analysis, that's kind of what I had hoped to bring into my own South Asian American community when I came to SALT about 5 years ago. So that's a little bit about my path. Thank you.
So I guess I was going to say, you know, maybe the key here is having gone to Berkeley, because I too am a Berkeley alum, but I know Glenn's not, and Glenn is fabulous. So clearly, you know, it's not about going to Berkeley. But what I wanted to say is there really is no one path to a career. Like, there's so many different ways to get to a career. And I would say I am great evidence for saying there's just no one path to a career, because I've gone all over the place, and I, you know, never knew that I was going to end up here. And I know there are other people who ended up here in a much more straightforward way. So I went to law school, I did a clerkship, and so then, you know, that was sort of my formative grounding of education, where I really knew that I wanted to do something to help people. But I didn't exactly know how or in what way. And so, you know, just doing law school and doing clerkship, all of that was sort of just getting like a basic set of educational credentials, right? And so then I would say like the next phase of my career path is, you know, sort of exploring a lot of things. I could call it wandering in the woods, or I could just call it really gaining skills. So I was able to get a job at the Department of Education. I just randomly applied to a whole bunch of different law jobs in Washington, D.C. I got a job offer from the Department of Education in their general counsel's office. I didn't even really know what the general counsel's office did, but I thought, this is gonna be great. I wanna work in the government and help people. But it turned out to be a fabulous experience. A little bit boring of a job, because what I worked on was writing regulations. I was the lawyer who wrote the regulations. I wasn't the expert on the content. I wasn't any of my expertise was in writing regulations. But it was really good because I learned a lot about the administrative process. I learned a lot about rules and comments and all of that stuff, which is really handy right now in our immigration fights right now, because there's so many rules and regulations that are being promulgated. So I learned a lot about administrative law, and it was really useful. And then from there, I was able to get a job in the nonprofit. At the time, it wasn't called Asian Americans Advancing Justice, but it is that now. And there was great because it was at the time, it was really small organization. There was like 4 of us there, maybe 5. And I had to do a little bit of everything. I did advocacy, I did you know, community outreach, I did communications work, I even had the opportunity to testify before Congress. I mean, here I am, like 26 years old. I testified before Congress, right? So it's crazy. But that's what happens when you work somewhere really small, is that you get a lot of opportunities. And so I got to do a lot of different things, and that was really great. And then I got an offer to work as a special assistant on President Clinton's Race Initiative. And I got this offer from the general counsel at the Department of Education. So it was one of these things where, like, by networking, by doing a good job, somebody sort of saw me, knew a little bit about what I was doing. And she came from the nonprofit world. So she knew the executive director at the Asian Americans Justice Center at the time. And so she, had comfort level that, if, the ED there thought I was doing a good job, then, I must be doing a good job. And that was really an interesting experience because I learned a lot about what it's like to work in a highly politicized environment. So it's like, it wasn't in the White House. It was like a little commission off of the White House, but President Clinton was really interested in race issues and trying to bridge the divide on race. And so it got a lot of high level attention. And so I learned a lot about politics, developing a political sense, what it's like to work with White House types. So that was really great. I, of course, at that point got kind of tired of all of that after having done that, because if you're not used to it, it can be quite disheartening, I'll say, because there's a lot of politics, especially if you really believe in an issue and you realize that politics sometimes trumps the moving forward of an issue in a positive way. So I went back to trying to practice law, and I ended up working at the Attorney General's office in Massachusetts, working on civil rights cases, and I was prosecuting civil hate crime cases, housing discrimination cases, doing litigation. And I learned I didn't like litigation. And so I ended up working at a research center affiliated with the Harvard Law School called the Civil Rights Project. I did a lot of research. I worked with a lot of academics. I worked with great graduate students. And I learned that I felt like the academic world was a little bit too removed from real change. And so that was something that I learned. So what I'm saying is I think I learned a lot from a lot of these different jobs, got different skills. And, I think I did a couple other jobs. I came back to the DC area, and I worked at the EEOC. And I worked for a stint at the First Lady Michelle Obama's office. And I think for me, those jobs, taught me all sorts of skills. But at the time in my stage of life, what I really learned was really trying to figure out what's important in life. Work-family balance, how much of it do you need? How important is it to have like really great perks, or not, right? Because working in the White House, you have access to a lot of stuff, you get a lot of perks, but is that really what's meaningful in your own life, right? And so for me, I really got to think about, what has real meaning for me. And that led me back to the nonprofit world, where I feel like we make a difference. Now I'm really trying to sort of live up to my slogan. So when I was working at the Asian American Justice Center, they have my ED had gone through management training, and she came back and she said, okay, everyone needs to come up with a slogan. Like, what is it, what's your mantra, about like why you're doing this work and what you're doing. And so now I'm really trying to live up to that slogan, which is basically trying to build a society where everyone has the ability to live up to their full potential. And I think doing advocacy around immigrants and immigration and trying to remove barriers for undocumented immigrants or people who just really want to make a better life for themselves as refugees or asylum seekers. That's what I'm trying to do and trying to live up to that slogan.
So yeah, that was really great. And just a good reminder that you never know what role or what person you may come across that will help sort of shape your trajectory and career. So everyone counts. Quinn?
Well, I want to be Jacinta when I grow up, but my story also echoes that there's no one path, and that for me was really about exploring my passions and love and curiosities. And so how that started was when I graduated from Berkeley. I think my biggest education was actually what happened afterwards, which was doing work in the community. I knew that I wanted to do some type of work that contributed back to immigrant and refugee communities. And so I found this job with the International Children's Assistance Network, which is a small Vietnamese American nonprofit in San Jose, California. And I was paid on a AmeriCorps-like stipend, which meant that I was paid $1,200 a month. And my brother at the time was a part-time bank teller at Bank of America. as a high school student, and he was making way more than me. And he's like, what are you doing with your life? Like, why did you graduate with this degree and then go back and into the community and do this work? And for me, it was an opportunity of a lifetime to really understand my community. We ran parenting workshops for parents and grandparents and aunties and uncles of kids 0 to 5. And in those parenting workshops, we created spaces for community members to talk about Vietnamese child rearing practices, but then also be exposed to child development and learning about ways to raise multicultural children. And I felt so blessed that this programming existed, and I couldn't imagine what my parents must have experienced raising refugee kids with no one else around them, with no one else to talk to. And that if we were able to create a sense of community and love as opposed to isolation that my parents grew up with and that I grew up with, and growing up with so much misunderstanding and hurt and pain, that this was the type of community that I wanted to be a part of building. And so my role was doing outreach for these parenting workshops at first. In my first workshop, we're supposed to have 15 participants. There were 4. It was December. It was raining, and I didn't know how to do community outreach exactly at the moment, at the time. And so then I reflected back, I thought, okay, where does my dad get his information? He gets his information from Vietnamese radio, Vietnamese newspapers. He gets his information from the churches, and my families get their information from the temples. So then I started creating relationships with Vietnamese media in San Jose. I also built relationships with the churches and temples in San Jose. And the next round of parenting workshops, we had over 50 people registered. And we had a waiting list for the next 3 years for every single cohort. And the other really amazing part of my work was getting to do home visit interviews with the participants from our parenting workshops, where folks got to share with us how incredible the programming was, but they also shared with us recommendations for how we could improve the organization. And it was really painful to me that we were always so resource strapped that we couldn't make these changes happen. And I was also really frustrated that when funding decisions came around, particularly from the city or the county, that we were always in reactive mode, and that we were never at the table when it came to saying these are the priorities where funding should go to, and why is it that immigrant and refugee organizations continue to be so underfunded, even though this is one of the largest communities in the entire nation. And that led me back to school to get my master's in public policy. And I found CRAC soon after that, where I was given an opportunity to either be a Sacramento-based advocate or an education advocate in DC. And Dua Tall, who was the executive director at the time, was so influential. She offered me both positions and said, you can choose whichever one you want. But I think that DC is where the community needs you, because there is no one else here who understands what it means to work with parents, what it means to organize with grandparents, and your voice needs to be here. Their voices need to be here. And that's what brought me to CRAC. A couple years after that, I transitioned into the executive director position, something that I never imagined. Like, I definitely thought I was gonna go into the for-profit world for a little bit, go into government, then come back to nonprofit and become an executive director, maybe. But now it's 6 years, and I've been with the organization for 9 years. So I definitely just encourage folks to continue to explore their curiosities, their passions, and also be really open to making mistakes, like really big mistakes, because I feel like that is where we learn most and where we grow most. So that's a little bit of how I got here.
Thank you, Glenn.
I want to intern for all these places.
I know.
I'm also the oldest one because, you know, I think I actually am I'm 52 now. And I started this, I have a very different trajectory. I came out of the 1980s in the height of the HIV and AIDS crisis. For me, when I came out as gay, I thought I was going to catch AIDS and die. I was one of those kids who wanted to commit suicide and bought sleeping pills. You know, when I came to college, I was very out, very flamboyant. Not that I'm not now, but you know, I would rather hang out in the Gay and Lesbian Alliance office. We called it Gala back then, rather than go to class. And I did not do well and had to deal with an assault for being gay, with death threats. And for me, I have an F, a real F, not an A- Asian F, like two of them. It's like impossible to graduate out. You know, I went to a state school. I didn't go to Berkeley. Although I did advocate for Berkeley later on when I worked for the UC. For me, my opportunity came from affirmative action. And I am, you know, I went to law school. I went to a broke ass law school, fourth year. And it was the only school, well, one of the only schools that was willing to take a risk on me. I had none of the indicators that I would succeed. In fact, all of my indicators, my metrics, my LSAT score, my grades, this F, said that I would probably fail out after my first year. But the admissions office had an incredibly, and it was a private law school, had an incredibly strong, probably illegal, but it's a private school, affirmative action program, and I got in. And I buckled down. I graduated, you know, I made law review. I made law review twice, for those of you who are lawyers. I graded on and I wrote on. You know, I graduated at the top of my class. I got a fellowship and, you know, a coveted fellowship and worked in civil rights enforcement. And I filed cases at the United States Supreme Court. I too had testified before Congress, but not at 26. I think I was 36 when I did it. And then I transitioned about 8 years ago to this gig. I never thought I could run a national organization. I never thought I could raise $1 million. I never thought I could change narratives and coach other people to go into an executive management position. I thought I was unqualified. And it was other mentors from my network. Note, write that down, network. Jacinta said it, we all said it, who saw a talent in me that needed to come to the fore. And that is how I got to this position. So, you know, for me, it was a very difficult position. And I am that story of affirmative action letting in unqualified people. Because on all metrics, I was completely unqualified. And yet I'm the person who has built more rights for this community, in the legal community, by filing cases, I mean, not more than these people, than ever before. And have argued, you know, at the, taken cases in the Supreme Court and have told President Obama himself what to do. And then the Secret Service scuttled me out. So that's another story. Affirmative action for me gave me an opportunity. And it did let somebody who was unqualified in, but who had a talent, who could achieve so much. And so that is my story and how it happened. I wanted to say one last thing, because I did have a call to action. I called it, I wanted to yell at people. And there were questions in the beginning of this program. How do you advocate on the questions, like how do you effectively advocate? I work with a lot of young people, millennials, college. I teach, you know, Asian American studies at 2 schools. Everybody's liking something. Everybody's doing a Twitter storm. I'm over Twitter storms. Unless you are friends with Mitch McConnell, it doesn't fucking matter, sorry. You know, you need to take a demand to a decision maker. And that's why I put in the chat box, take action, send an email. And I'm real serious about this because this is what happened in the election. is everybody thought that like, oh, it's fine, this won't happen. Everybody in your universe of your Facebook friends may not agree with you, but you are not taking a demand for racial justice, for immigrants' rights, to the people who actually have the power to ameliorate a circumstance for our community. And even an email is a small little thing to do, but it's a lot more effective than just liking something. It's a lot more effective than just retweeting to the people that you know. And again, unless you're friends with Mitch McConnell or a member of Congress or the Senate, then it's okay. Then you should tweet a lot. But unless you're that person, your voice, those email messages get piled on with other email messages, with postcards, and with letters that we do. And it does let those people who really should abolish ICE, defund the police, safeguard immigrants' rights, fight anti-Asian violence, create systems that will make the world so much better for all of us and the people who we serve and our parents who have sacrificed so greatly for us. And so that was my call to action. I put it in the email. How many of y'all are sending out emails to Congress? Y'all need to click on the link. I did another one on Daca too for a clean Daca. There are other people on this email who may have call to actions. Y'all can send that out too. But we need to raise our voices more than ever before. And protesting the street is good too. But you also need to take it to a direct demand to that person who can make a difference. All right, that's my preaching. Thank you so much.
Can I reinforce? I'm not going to do it as well as Glenn, obviously, but I just want to reinforce the need for people to take action. I mean, I know a lot of people are afraid of engaging, afraid of taking a position, of being afraid of being on record. But we need people to do that. And I think there's also sometimes people feel overwhelmed. There's so much to do. What should I do? I can't do it all, so I'm not going to do anything. And that's an understandable feeling, but it is okay to just do as much as you can do, because every little bit counts. Every bit is valuable, and we need everyone to help. And it's not always just in a band. Sometimes it's thanking people for doing the right thing too. I think that's really important. And I think I'm just going to end with, this proverb that I always have to tell myself. It's an African proverb that says, if you want to go somewhere fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, then go together. And so, I really hope that we can all go together and get further because we have a long way to go.
So, well, this has been truly amazing. I want to thank you all for sharing your time and space with us tonight. I'm leaving so inspired and so much more knowledgeable and more driven to act in my own personal and professional lives. And I hope all the audience members and attendees feel similarly. And so with that, I'm gonna pass it along to Alma.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Am I still cutting out?
You're good.
Thank you. Thank you, Sham. And I'll just echo all of those thank yous to all of our panelists tonight. I think this was a really thoughtful and engaging conversation. I got a lot out of it, and I know our attendees did too. Am I doing the right thing here? Glenn, I believe you have a short closing activity for us. Is that ringing a bell?
No, I did it already. That was my yelling point.
Oh, great.
Did you do it? All the people on the Zoom. Did you email or are you checking out your MySpace page? Oh, we don't use MySpace. I'm sorry, Friendster. You know how old I am.
Perfect. Well, with that, before I wrap us up, I do have a few quick promotional plugs. So first, I'll share that CAPAL's next and final WLP session for the summer will be Wednesday, July 22nd. So mark it down in your calendars. The session is titled Be the Change, Energy, and Sustainability. We'll be covering international, national, and local efforts to combat climate change, as well as talking about individual actions we can all be taking to address this global issue. If you're interested in joining us for that event, for any future events, I strongly encourage you to check out our website. You'll find lots of helpful information on there about how to get involved and support our work. just to name a few. You can sign up for our monthly newsletter. I promise we won't spam you, and it's a good way to stay up to date with everything we're up to. If you are an undergraduate or graduate student, I encourage you to look into our scholarship and internship program. You can also learn more about that on our website. Through the program, we provide students from across the country with opportunities to work directly in public service. Our application cycle opens every November, so keep an eye out for that. Lastly, if you or an organization you're affiliated with is interested in working with us, partnering, sponsoring any of our events, we have plenty of those opportunities. We'd be happy to talk about them. So feel free to get in touch over email, through the website, whatever works for you. Lastly, after tonight's session ends, you'll be prompted to complete a very quick feedback survey. It'll pop up on your screen. Your candid reflections and suggestions play a super important role in shaping our future programming. So if you do have a few extra minutes, please do complete that. And that's it for me. Thank you again to all of our panelists, to Sham. This was a really, really great conversation. And thank you to all the attendees who made the time.
Can we thank Sean?
Thank you.